Hello and welcome back to Anima Zoo. It's been a little while since we've been here, but we are returning with some new construction today. So last time we put in the Himalayan brown bear habitat with the beautiful underwater viewing area, and combined with our deer habitat and our Amma leopard, that brings us to a grand total of 3 animals in the zoo so far. So we're going to expand on that today by adding in the Pallas's cat with a totally different vibe of habitat, something much smaller and also based on a real life location. So let's take a look at that before we dive in. So I found this picture of a new Pallas's cat enclosure on zoochat.com. And it may not be like the grandest habitat that you've ever seen in the world, but I really like the simplicity of it. And I think having something like this will add a touch of extra realism to our zoo without everything being so kind of grand and over the top. So heavy inspiration being taken from this picture and this enclosure. I'm not entirely sure what zoo it's from. It's in the category of Cotswold Wildlife Park, so maybe it's there, but let me know in the comments below if you do know. But just before we dive in, a quick word from today's video sponsor, which is Instant Gaming. So if you are looking to pick up any of the extensive number of Planet Zoo DLCs, please do check out my link in the description below, where you can access all of these DLCs at really great discounted prices. And not only that, but a whole host of other games like Jurassic World Evolution 3, Planet Coaster 2, Battlefield 6, or even City Skylines and all of the associated DLCs alongside that too. So if you're looking to boost your Planet Zoo content in-game or want to check out any other games at great prices, please do use that link and help to support the channel. So this is the area that we'll be using, and I'll give you a bit of perspective on it when we get to the end walkthrough, but it is the area between the Himalayan bear habitat and the lake, which is a very small piece of land, which was part of the reason why I chose the Pallas's cat for this, because there's very limited space to work with in terms of the habitat. I think the most that we could possibly squeeze out of this area was around about 600 metres squared, which isn't a great deal at all. And the Pallas's cat needs a lot less than that, which I was very grateful for. So before we get too far, we're just marking out the area with the invisible barriers so that we can check that we do have enough, because this habitat is going to be very close to the limits of what the cat can take. So as you can see here, we've got 316 metres squared in total, and the area needed with a couple of adults and a couple of juveniles is 290, so we are really very close to the limit on this. And of course, while I want to make a realistic zoo, I also want to make it functional to some of the game limits. We are ignoring foliage, I will admit, during this, just so that we can design how we want to, and some of those limits are a bit restricting. But I'd like to at least try and adhere to the size of the habitat element of it. And with all our rocks in, we're going to be super close, like I said. So here we're just setting up a template for one of the sections of the enclosure here, and I'm using the Twilight Pack masonwork wall as the base of it, because I noticed in the real life version there was a kind of sort of oldish looking stone base, so I thought this was the most appropriate fit to that. And then of course we're adding our mesh above that. Now I'm doing it in 2 meters by 4 meters high increments here, because you'll see in a second, we can snap in our wooden beams nicely into the middle of it, and I definitely want the wooden beams to be 2 meters apart rather than 4 to get the similar effect that we saw in the reference photo that we're using for inspiration here. And originally I thought I was going to need it in 2 meter increments anyway, based on where I was going to put the viewing windows, but that turned out to not actually be the case in the end, but there we go. And we're just going to use the simple Planet Zoo beam square, the painted version, so that we can change the colour of it slightly to get that sort of new looking wood effect that we want to see here. And I think that's one thing I really liked about this enclosure, and the way it could fit into Anima Zoo as well is that it could be, the base of it sort of indicates that maybe it was once an older building here and actually it's been sort of knocked down, and this modern cage, or newish cage at least, has been built onto the top of it and it's been sort of converted into some kind of habitat, which I quite like the idea of. So that's sort of the effect that I want to emulate here, again as per the reference photo that we saw previously. Of course, as always, I'm going to frame the entire structure in our wooden beams so that we get a nice enclosure for it as well, putting one on the bottom so the mesh isn't just simply attached straight into a stone wall, which feels a bit unrealistic. And then we go ahead and add a piece of the top section into it. Now I'm actually doing 8 meters through the back here. The whole enclosure is actually only 12 meters deep. And just to mention at this point too as well, when I was doing the invisible barriers for it, I was very purposefully, knowing that it was going to be a very rectangular building, using 4 meter increments snapped to an angle so that I got the outline of the building that I could trace around essentially when I was creating this piece. So you would have seen me earlier very carefully placing in that masonwork piece of wall that lines up with that section of the actual habitat barrier that we're using here, which was quite important to be able to just easily get this in. But yeah, we're doing the roof a little bit further over, and then when we come to copy it into the other side, we delete part of it out, which is not a problem. And then we come on to some smaller little details here, which is using this hinge piece just to add some sort of nail effect details into the woodwork here. So we're just putting it kind of at the top and bottom of each segment, just one of these little hinges sunk into the wood. It's so small that it doesn't point out the other side, so it's a great little building piece to use for kind of tiny details like this. And then I use one of our European marquee beams as well, the metal beams, just to kind of give a little bit of a sort of sill or a base to the bottom of the mesh frame. Again, something that you could imagine it was attached to on top of the wall, which just helped to finish off that edge a little bit. Otherwise, some of the tops of the walls are just a little bit too square and straight and perfect for my liking. And then once we've got our piece set up like this, we can just really easily copy it into the grid. So we're copying all the elements of our building piece, and because we've got that wall element there, which is grid based, it means that everything just snaps into place so easily. Then we just have to slide across an element of the beams to sit on the end of the frame here as well. So it's really nice and easy. We can do the same thing going back to the other side as mentioned, and then I do just delete out some of the additional top pieces later on. And then copy just the vertical segment to fill in each end too. So it's so easy once you've got one segment of this to get in the entire closure. And that's another thing I quite liked from the reference photo, was actually when I saw it, I knew it would be relatively easy to translate into the game, unlike things like our Amma leopard habitat, which was very complicated to build the outside enclosure for. Now, the one space that I didn't add our templated wall cage feature was around the keeper gate area. And here I'm using, just again the base game, Planet Zoo, plank thick painted 1 metre, coloured into our same natural wood colour just to fill in the gaps between the keeper gate and our existing walls. Now this was a little bit tricky because I actually hadn't put the keeper gate perfectly in the middle. If you can kind of see on the left hand side of the screen now, you can see the invisible barrier slightly sticking out. It's really hard to get it right smack bang in the middle of that 4 metre increment, which is quite annoying. So in this case, on one side of it, I had to use 2 of these joined up together because the 2 metre was too long, the 1 metre not long enough. So I just merged in 2 of them to fill in the other side and made these sort of quite close. So it gives us a really nice solid wall around the keeper gate, which I actually really like because of the hinge decals on the gate. They stick out on top of the wood on either side of the actual door. So it looks pretty cool from that perspective, in my opinion. And then we just frame it off with some more of the basic Planet Zoo beams at the top and more of our mesh fencing above it as well. So I think it fits nicely into the design of the enclosure while also being a little bit different. But as always with all of my other habitats, and it won't be any different here, we'll be kind of hiding this away a little bit, which I'll touch on later on. So you won't sort of be able to see this solid wall from the outside of the enclosure. It's something that's going to be very much hidden on the inside of it. And then the final decal being adding a few more of our hinges as our nails in and around the door here. I was tempted to put them all the way up the planks, but I didn't go quite that far. And then before I got onto the viewing windows, I wanted to get the pathway in so I could see what kind of distance I was working with between the path and the actual enclosure. And also I realised I hadn't tested in putting in the path here, so I was hoping it was going to join up to our main path, which, as you can see, it did. And so then in order to get our viewing windows in, I just delete out a couple of the sections, 4 metres wide in this case, for the panels as to where we're going to add the windows. And it was at this point I realised that the whole enclosure was actually a little bit high, and I had intended, when I was coming up with the concept, to sink it down to the ground a little bit, because even using just the 1 metre wall at the bottom of it, it's pretty high when children are looking over it and into the enclosure. And with the Pallas's cat being so tiny, and I'm going to address that as well with another thing in just a second, I thought it was quite important to lower this down so they get the maximum possible viewing experience through the window. And also going back to our reference photo, I was conscious that there were wooden planks at the bottom of the window as well, which was also going to raise the height up. So with all of that combined, I decided to lower the entire enclosure, which, as you can see here, totally messed up the keeper gate. So we had to come through and just adjust this slightly, raise up those plank walls and reduce the size of the mesh at the top, which was no problem at all in the end. And coming back to the windows, in keeping with the rest of the wood in this enclosure, we are using the base game Planet Zoo plank thin painted to the colour that we are using here. And 3 of those stacked one on top of each other to form a base to the windows. And again, going back to the reference photo, you can see that here, and this was very much what I was trying to recreate in this enclosure that we're building at this space. So I think these worked pretty well for that. And then of course, with it being a glass window, I was going to use a frameless piece of glass here. So I wanted to add in my own frame. So we're using the European marquee beams for this all the way around, and then adding in the glass, which is actually going to be a one-way glass. So the Pallas's cat is actually quite a shy animal, so I was very conscious that this is a very open enclosure, with it just being mesh all the way around and a lot of space for people to view into the enclosure, and it's not very deep either from the front. So having these one-way glass windows gives them just that tiny little bit of extra protection from the viewing guests outside. And obviously the glass panel gives the guests a really clear view straight through into the enclosure as well. So it's sort of a win-win from both perspectives here. And we just use the European marquee beam all the way around the window, as you can see here. And I actually decided to make it a little bit shorter, just so that we could fit in a 2-metre section of mesh above it, mainly. So the glass panel's actually sunk down into the planks at the bottom, which you obviously can't see, so it's not a problem from that perspective. But we don't have any shorter Planet Zoo wooden beams to add in around our mesh above it, so it kind of had to be this way. But actually I think it looks pretty nice. It's sort of a longer and thinner window from what it could have been otherwise. And then again, we're going to make use of these little hinge assets to create some decals onto our glass to make it look like it is actually affixed to the frame here. And I absolutely love how these work. Just again, sunk into the side, a little bit of it pointing out gives a really, really nice, just tiny extra detail around the glass. And there's so many things that you could do like this in all enclosures, really. And I try to do little bits of this, but not go so OTT with it that it's incredibly time consuming and maybe things that we wouldn't necessarily otherwise see. But I think in this case it works pretty well. And of course we're adding more nails under the window because why not? And then we just simply copy across our window section to the other side. And boom, just like that, we have 2 viewing windows in our enclosure. And now with the fact that we have these planks at the bottom, and it obviously means that children are going to still struggle to look in and see the Pallas's cat with them being so tiny, I decided to raise up the terrain inside the habitat so that Pallas's cat was more on an eye level when you're looking through that window, or over the wall at the very least. So we raise up all the terrain here, and actually I realised at this point that because I've switched to a new PC, I think some of my settings have reset. So terrain collision was still on with building pieces, but I actually didn't raise up around the edges. And I didn't realise that that's what was stopping it until later in the episode, but it actually worked out pretty well because I do come around a little bit later and fill in those nasty gaps between the terrain and the wall with some flat rock surfaces. And with the Pallas's cat liking a lot of rock surface, it actually works out pretty well. Now, as at this point, I may have not recorded a small section, I'm so sorry. So what you can see here is what I did do, which was add in a small enclosure around the keeper gate, which you can see here using our gate blueprint that we actually did in episode 1 of Anima Zoo, and using some of the Australian planks around the outside of that, which hides it away pretty nicely. We also used the Planet Zoo metal fence around the windows here to replicate again what we saw in our reference photo, with a little bit of mulch and a few plants in the flower beds around it. And I did also add in concrete panels as a flooring to this piece of path, just so that we could bring the pathway up to the window. So unfortunately guests won't go all the way up, but we're simulating the idea that they can at the very least. And then the final thing before we come on to the inside of the enclosure was just to add a little bit of age and wear to our walls. Like I said at the beginning, I wanted this to feel like it was an existing brick building which had then, been knocked down and converted into this enclosure for the Pallas's cat. And also going back to the reference photo as well, there's definitely a bit of grunge and moss and some aging on the brickwork at the bottom as well. So that's what we're doing here. So we're adding some damage decals, some moss decals, and also this grunge just to the bottom of the walls, which I really, really enjoy. It's not that often that I actually play with the decals in Planet Zoo, but I think doing it here has given me a lot of satisfaction. It's typically on the inside of enclosures that I would use them rather than sort of the outside of the buildings, which I have done in this case. I haven't put anything on the inside because the walls around the bottom of the enclosure are covered up by us raising the terrain and placing rocks around the inside, which we will see in a second, so that didn't matter. But just around the outside, and particularly these viewing points where the walls are really open and obvious to the guests, and where you'll actually see in the zoo if you were to visit it. And then once we'd done that, I did actually come around the edges of the pathway here as well with a little bit of grunge, which just takes away some of the starkness of the concrete and also helps to kind of blend in the edges of it around where the fence is, and it doesn't line up perfectly. Just having a little bit of grunge there next to the mulch, in between the mulch and the concrete, I think really helps. I really like how this looks in the end, actually. Just adds a nice little touch of realism, I think, to the outside of the enclosure here. And then if we head on back inside, the first thing I did want to do was level the floor, as I mentioned. So we're just using some of our tiger rocks to go in with the theme of our map. And this way, the edges of them going up to the grass aren't going to look so stark when we start painting the terrain and using some of that rock surface, which the Pallas's cat needs a lot of rock surface in their enclosures. Not very much grass, it's all kind of soil and rock really what they're focused on, and snow as well if you have it. But this also worked quite well because when I was looking at reference photos of Pallas's cats, they were all on kind of rocky mountainous terrain in long grass and that sort of thing. So actually I'm kind of happy with how this came out in the end, even if I did forget about the terraforming settings there. So it worked out, I think. But yeah, you'll see here we're coming under the window with these rocks, and it's just helping it to lift up to the level that the guests in the zoo are going to be viewing the cats at. So from that perspective, it works brilliantly for such a small animal. And then around the edges, obviously we've got the keeper coming in at normal ground height. So we've just sloped off the terrain here and using some of the rocks to slope down towards that area to make sure that the keeper can easily walk up into the main part of the habitat, but also the Pallas cats as well. So they can't jump up big kind of steps in the rock either because they're so small. And the next thing I did was actually get in our Pallas's cats. So we have one male and one female in here, which is all that is allowed for a breeding enclosure such as this. And I did manage to get some pretty decent ones. So I got a silver rated female and I think a bronze rated male as well. So it's not too shabby. But you can see the terrain issues are pretty dire. We are right on the edge before we've put anything like foliage or larger rocks or climbing equipment or anything into the enclosure. So we are certainly on the line with this one, and I think if they have babies, then unfortunately they are going to be complaining about the available space in the habitat. So the other interesting thing about the Pallas's cat is that they don't actually require any climbing, which I thought was kind of unusual because they're animals that definitely can climb. So with that, I wanted to use some of the enrichment to put a bit of a focus area on, which I'll come onto here. But you can see I've put the feeding tray right in front of the viewing window. I always kind of like to do that, so it's a prominent place where the cats will gather that the guests can view. I've also got a big scratching post right in the centre, which I really liked actually because the height of it almost perfectly aligned to the top of the cage here. So it almost looks like it's a support post in the middle of the enclosure rather than being a bit of an eyesore. So I thought that was quite a nice way to integrate that enrichment item at least. And then we come on to the water. Now usually I try and hide this away somewhere, but actually I wanted to make this into a little bit of a feature for the Pallas's cats. So I'm going to cover it up with rocks so it almost looks like it's like a tap or a drip coming out of a man-made rock in this case, and then build up a bit of a climbing rock behind it as a feature for this end of the enclosure. So we've got the feeding tray at the other viewing window and then this big sort of climbing rock at this end, and this just helps to integrate that water pump a lot better. So for this we're using a combination of the Aquatic Pack faux rocks. The Aquatic Pack is such a good one, go and check out Insta Gaming if you haven't got it already, and then also our base game themed tiger rocks in here as well. Now we do recolour the aquatic faux rocks to be more similar to the tiger rocks. It's not exactly bang on, which I'm okay with, because in a zoo like this, I think this would quite obviously be a man-made structure, what we're trying to create here. So the look of that faux rock being slightly different to the real rocks, I think actually adds to the sort of effect that it is a feature that has been built in. And then in order to get the cats right up to the top of this large rock that I've placed, I used these smaller faux rocks as little steps essentially. But when I was looking at the availability of them getting up there, it was a little bit patchy. So I then decided to add in some of the natural climbing logs up to here, just to help them get up to the top. And it was a little bit fiddly, but in the end I kind of think it looks pretty cool with these little logs going up to the top of the rock there. But the other thing I did want to make sure that we could do was actually get the cats underneath this archway in the step staircase here, but also try and make it look like it's actually supported, which was kind of tricky. So I just had to fiddle with a few of the rocks, move them backwards and forwards using our advanced move X function. And we got there in the end, and both cats can travel through the rocks underneath the archway and up onto the top of the rock. And that was achieved just by me putting some of the log climbing platforms integrated into the rock. Again, with it being a faux rock, I'm not too worried with it sinking into the rock. I think that's absolutely fine for this. And also no one's going to see it from the height that the guests are viewing at. So that works to get both of the cats up onto the top of the rock and underneath the archway. And then I just came in and added a few more rocks around the base of our water pump here just to kind of integrate it in. So you can see now it looks like a little bit of a more natural but clearly man-made feature into our habitat. And then because we've actually got quite a bit more space in here, I decided to add another climbing platform at a slightly lower level, just behind where the feeding tray was going to be. So for this I just used one of the large rocks to create a slope up to it, so rather than having to use branches or anything like that, it was just easy for them to access and walk straight up onto the top of that rock, just giving a little bit more height to the back of the habitat. And then in order to make sure the cats actually climb onto these rocks and use them, I put some enrichment items up there, like a blood scent marker and cardboard boxes on both of them. So hopefully they will actually go up there and play with those toys. Time will tell. So that was kind of the main larger features of the habitat in. So the next thing I did come through and do is paint the terrain. And again, this was to meet their needs. So mostly soil and rock and getting rid of most of the grass. Pretty much all the grass that you can see, but we do come through with foliage later and add a bit in. Again, the reference photos I was looking at, they were all in rocky, hilly terrain with long grass in it, so having some grass in there I don't think is a bad thing, and having some greenery is always a good thing, aesthetically at least. And here you can see the rock texture going in, which blends in so nicely with the tiger rocks at the edge. Really utilising your theme's rocks is such a good way to kind of blend in some of those awkward terrains. Like, you'd never imagine what this looked like when I'd raised up the terrain with those horrible jaggedy green edges before we did this. So yeah, really pleased with how this came out in the end. And then I got a little bit sidetracked considering actually what we were going to do on the outside of this cage, because it's so big and blocky and really obvious. I was thinking views from the other side of the lake were going to look super odd, and also for a bit of privacy for the animals as well. I decided to add these ivy patches around most of the outside of it actually in the end. But I quite like how this turns out as a bit of sort of natural privacy for the animals, making it feel a little bit more cozy and enclosed. I don't know if they want that, but I feel like that's a nice thing for cats at least. But also helping to make the outside a little bit better in that respect as well. So you can see here I also added a couple of little ivy patches to the outside to help it seem like the ivy was sort of growing through the mesh and through the structure as well. So really pleased again with how that comes out, and that really sort of helps to keep the enclosure feeling quite enclosed, for want of a better word. And then typically with habitats, what I like to do is put in the features like we have done with the climbing rocks, and then come in and put in some larger foliage, so things like trees or potentially larger bushes and that sort of thing. So I wanted to try and get some semblance of a tree in here, even though the height of it is really quite low. It's actually only 4 meters up to the ceiling in the end, once we've raised that terrain up at the bottom there. But this Himalayan birch tree actually sunk into the ground, worked really well for that. So we put that as a bit of a feature in front of this rock platform here, sticking out into the habitat. And it just about fits once we've sunk it down into the ground a little bit. And then we just used some of the pea shrubs around it and some bracken to kind of cover up the awkwardness of the base of it, where it's sunk in a little bit weirdly. And then I went through and added a few more shrubs, the pea shrubs, dog rose bushes, lady ferns, and a few other little smaller bits. And I got sidetracked again with coming to the outside and thinking more about the back this time. And for that, I decided to use the wild hedgerow to frame a lot of the back, and also the other side that we hadn't done with the ivy just yet. And I quite like how this looked. It adds to the feeling of an enclosure at the bottom level there, particularly where we've raised the height up to the bottom of the mesh. It feels super kind of open at the back of the enclosure there. So this wild hedgerow I think helps to bring it all together and bring it in a little bit. We do that down the side a little bit later on as well. and also add ivy above it to continue the theme from the first wall that we did there. So it's really sort of nicely cozy and den-like come the end of it. And I kind of flipped all over when I did the inside of this, so it's not really in a logical order, apologies. But then we went back to adding a few more bushes. So we add in some of these reeds, a few little aster flowers as well. So coming onto the grass, I just wanted a couple of little more colourful flowers dotted around the place. So just a few of those strategically placed worked pretty well. Also some of the aspen bushes in addition to that too. And then bamboo, being native to Asia, where the Pallas cat's based. Another reason why I chose it, actually, thinking we've got the Himalayan brown bears there. And coming on to more of the sort of cold weather animals, the Pallas cat fits into that quite well. So I used the bamboo, which is super nice and thick, to cover up the side of the mesh looking onto the keeper gate area. So that really helps to hide that away really nicely. And then this dog rose bush in front of it also does the trick at sort of covering up that very stark, plain, boring back corner, but also adds an area as well where the cats can go to get away from the people, so it's quite hidden and private around that side now. And then a few more little touches. We added in some of this ivy along the edges of the front of the habitat here, just to add a little bit of something kind of growing along the edges underneath the viewing windows, which I thought once we add the grass in as well, it's not super obvious, but it's a little bit of something growing along the sides here, which I thought would be quite natural if we've got ivy growing up around the mesh on the sides as well. I mean, I know from experience in my own garden that ivy seems to go absolutely everywhere and in all directions, so that's what we've done here. And then just before adding in the grass, I do come in with a couple of the tiny faux rocks, again coloured into a sort of similar colour to our tiger rock theme, and then just dotted these in a few places amongst the terrain, just to add a little bit of dynamicism to the terrain. And again, thinking about the reference photos that I saw of the cats, it was always on very rocky terrain, so even though these are tiny, I just think it adds a nice little certain something, particularly around our rock structures as well, around the base of the stairs, adds a little certain extra something that helps with the realism around here. Oh, and then I did also forget to put in the cat's burrow, so we did that, which slotted in very, very nicely into our little rock structure behind the feeding platform here. So nice and obvious for the guests to see it, and a kind of cool way to blend that into the environment as well, just sinking it into the back of the rock there. And then finally topping off with a little bit of grass. So I used some of the dry buffalo grass in a few places. I mixed it in with the greener normal buffalo grass. And the reason for that is I just like a little bit of colour change and variation in the grass. That's why we've got a few of the asters in there as well, to have a couple of patches of flowers, but also the colour change in the buffalo grass helps make it feel a bit more natural and less kind of static. If it's all just one type of grass, it can look a little bit repetitive. And the dry grass actually blends in pretty well with the greener grass here for a nice natural touch. And I know we're putting grass onto rock here as well, which is not the most sensible thing, but I think come the end of it, it doesn't look too bad, and maybe it could be soil underneath the grassy patches, potentially. That's the one thing that I did think this isn't quite right, but trying to adhere to their terrain constraints and also wanting some greenery and some natural environment grass in there, which I knew they had in their natural habitats. This is the way we got around it, but yeah, I'm pleased with how it looks in the end. And one final little thing, because it's something I always forget to do, I recoloured the sprinkler, so it blended in a little bit better. Alright, so just before we dive into a little walkthrough, I wanted to give some perspective on the zoo as a whole. So as you can see, our new Pallas cat habitat is right down here, opposite our Himalayan brown bears. Now there's a few additional structures that you haven't seen, and yeah, there's a few different reasons for this. So after the Himalayan brown bears, I was intending to do an upgrade to our staff area, including a dangerous animal habitat area, which is, yeah, we won't look at that. But I did actually do quite a bit of work and kind of complete this area up here, adding in a couple of little warehouses and a few props around that, and tidying up the rest of this area, so including this little zookeeper's shed covered support area here, and lots of little props around here, like some water barrels and a little bit of trash and maintenance type things around the yard here. We also did put in this roadway, so the sort of accessible roadway where vehicles could come down and through into our dangerous animal holding area down here, but I did not finish this off. And when I came back to Anima Zoo, obviously it's been a year, I will admit, yes, it's been a year. And when I came back to it, I kind of was looking at this area and I was struggling to piece together exactly where my mind was going on it previously. Hence, we've kind of pivoted to adding in a new habitat instead. But we will come back to finishing that off at some point. I have also added in this dome up here, which will be an episode at some point soon. This is very much based on the structure that is in that location in Belfast Zoo. If you've been there, you may know what I'm talking about. So yeah, we'll come back to that. But here is our Pallas's cat habitat, sitting quite nicely into this tiny little space here at the edge of the lake. So let's dive in and have a little walkthrough. So I just wanted to start up here, up the top in our entrance plaza, next to our memberships and adoptions hut over there as well. And if we walk around here, around our little statue over towards the viewing platform down over the deers, you can just get a little bit of a sneak peek of the Pallas's cat habitat in the background there. And what I do like is all that ivy on the mesh, on the frames, really kind of hides away the structure a little bit. I put in a couple of trees around it, which we'll go and take a look at in a minute. I really love the bent over pine tree hanging over the entrance into the lake there as well. But this is kind of the view that we get down over the amber leopards as well there in the background. A significantly smaller structure than that cage habitat. And then if we just start here next to our waterfall over the deer habitat over here, again, you can just sort of start to see it in the background as we work our way down the hill here. And come towards our amber leopard habitat on this side. And I've added in these little paw prints as well to show the route round the zoo, because I do want this to be quite a large zoo, but it's a project that I'm going to work on relatively slowly, but it will be much more frequent than it has been over the last couple of years, I can promise that. So yeah, let's just scoot on over the bridge over here next to our handyman, Bob. And we've got a lovely male red deer there, feeding on his enrichment. And here we go, we are coming up towards the Pallas's cat habitat now, and there's a keeper going in through the gate. And did he actually avoid the gate structures then? That might make me quite happy if they actually do walk through the open gate. I mean, it's a very, very narrow gap, but it is feasibly possible. And I wanted to leave it open just for a little bit of atmosphere, I suppose, there. But if we just start back here, what I have done with the pathways here is used faux rock number 1. Just recoloured a little bit. It's the same as we did around the amber leopard habitat here, just to frame the edge of the path and create this bit of a flower bed in the middle. And this is just all a bit of buffalo grass, some saltwort bushes, bracken, and a few of the little flowers dotted in here as well, with a couple of pine trees and a beech tree, I think, there too. Just adds a little bit of shade into the habitat, and also obviously separates it from the main path, which when we do eventually open the zoo, which I think we'll do next episode, and actually finally get some some guests in here, because we've got a decent number of animals now, then this will take the guests viewing the cats away from the main path, which I always think is quite important, especially because the deers, actually the viewing is the path over here. So we kind of don't want two either side of the path, particularly because it's not too wide at all. So yeah, I've added in a couple of, these are the small TV screens, so they're not actually education boards, but there are education boards hidden underneath the ground here that will provide the education. We also have a speaker actually right in the middle of the habitat up there. So there will be a decent amount of education. I've just added in one donation bin because, you know, you do see them around zoos. So I haven't tried to hide it here. It is pretty obvious, but it's only one around this habitat. So how much it would actually earn, I'm not too sure. And then, yeah, we can have a little look inside here at our Pallas's cat. So we've got one of them there. We've got the feeding tray, obviously, right in front of this window. And yeah, what I do like is you can't really see the keeper gate from here. It's all pretty hidden away with that bamboo in front, and obviously the dog rose bush covering that up. So you can't see that sort of very plain back corner where they can hide away up there. And I can only see one cat. We have got the burrow. I did think maybe I'd change this screen to the burrow cam actually, so you could see inside there. And of course he's walking down towards the other end of the habitat, but here we have our lovely climbing structure here. I'll see if I can get some shots at the end of them actually on the climbing structures, or feeding, or something a little bit more interesting. Is he going to go into the burrow? Oh no, he's just doing a poo. Lovely. But yeah, really like how the water features sat next to this rock structure. I think that's worked pretty well. And with the logs as well, they look a little bit higgledy-piggledy, but they work from a climbing perspective. And again, you can see like with the hedge and the ivy up the back and those couple of trees that I put in there now too, it does feel pretty sheltered and pretty enclosed and private for the Pallas's cats. So yeah, I'm enjoying that. And you can obviously see from this side with the one-way glass, that gives them a tiny bit of extra protection from the edge of the mesh cage here too. We can come into the habitat and take a look at the Pallas's cat. Not doing a lot, but they're there. I don't know where the other one is. It must be in the burrow. So let's take a little look. Okay, so one of our Pallas's cats is inside this inside this rock. Oh, they're moving now. Hang on a second. If we wait a minute. Ah, here we go. That is maybe a bug. I'm hoping it's a bug. There we go. Okay, that's interesting. Maybe I do need to fix up some of the habitat there, but there we go. We've got two of the cats climbing on the rock at the back, at least here. And what? Yeah, they're disappearing. I wonder why that is. If we tweak this rock a little bit, does that help? I've absolutely no idea, but there we go. They should be able to climb on it. I can't understand why they wouldn't, so we might need to put up some logs there if they keep clipping on through, but we can do that and make sure that they don't clip in future. But there we go. Anyway, that is the Pallas's cat habitat. I also added in one of our information boards here too, and then did a little bit more of our sort of natural foliage that we've done throughout the zoo around the back here. So these are actually a couple of beech trees sunk into the ground here, which I like the sort of bushy nature of the top of those trees. I think it adds a nice effect. I actually really like the top-down structure on this. I'm just seeing they are walking down the rock now. They're not sinking in, so yeah, just tweaking it a little bit does seem to have fixed that, which is good news. So we do have the two cats in there, and they're walking on the rocks correctly at the very least. Now this little area here, I was thinking maybe we'd do some sort of guest toilets and that sort of thing. And I'm pretty keen to do a restaurant, a lakeside restaurant, I think slightly further around, but maybe have a bit of a toilet block or a picnic area around here. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear what you've got to say on that. And do let me know name suggestions for our cats. And on that note, Sparrow left a comment on our last video, which was the most upvoted, which suggested we name our Himalayan brown bears after places in the Himalayas. So we have now got Yangra, and we also have Makalu. Love that suggestion, Sparrow. Thank you so much. And that's the name for our two starting Himalayan bears, at least in that habitat. So yes, let me know what you would like to call our Pallas's cats, and we'll name them next episode. Nice simple structure today, but something to get us back into Anima Zoo, and the videos will be more regular than they have been across the last year moving forward. So thank you so much for watching today. As always, if you enjoyed the video, a like and a comment is really greatly appreciated, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye bye.